many important men owned and lived in Decatur House. But where were the other players in its history? Some of the men only lived in Decatur for a short amount of time. After their death, their wives and daughters were handed full control over the house and its ownership. With the ability to hold property came the ability to exert their agency and gain economic independence. By looking at the female owners of Decatur House, we can see the different ways that each woman used the property to better their specific circumstances, even when society greatly limited women's actions. The Married Women's Property Act was officially passed in 1848 and allowed women separate autonomy from their husbands. This meant that they could independently conduct business, hold property, and file lawsuits. But long before 1848, women appeared to own estates. Why is that? Because of the Revolutionary War, the land transfer system was streamlined to permit easier transfer of titles to women and children. This meant that women could acquire property by inheritance before 1848. By this time in history, women still weren't allowed to work, so these properties became a form of economic security after their husband's death. This brings us to the first female property owner of Decatur House, Susan Decatur. Her and her husband designed and built the house to entertain D.C.'s political class. After her husband's sudden and untimely death in 1820, Susan Decatur moved to a small house in Georgetown. Partially to avoid the grief that Decatur House brought her, and partially because of her need to economically sustain herself, she rented the property to several ministers and secretaries of state. It was her only form of income, but it still wasn't enough to pay for her expenses. She ended up using her political connections to sell her White House-grade furniture to Andrew Jackson and pressure Congress into approving a petition to compensate her for her late husband's military victories. After the compensation was approved, the property was sold to the Gatsby family in 1836. 4 years later, John Gatsby passed away and left Decatur House, its belongings, and its slaves to his wife Providence. In the same will, he also leaves 12 lots to his daughters Augusta and Julia. He explicitly states that none of these properties should become subject to the control or disposition of their respective husbands, and that they may not be used to pay the debts or responsibilities of their spouses. He also explicitly authorizes Providence and his 2 daughters to collect any rent or profits from these properties. John Gatsby died before the passing of the Married Women's Property Act in 1848, so he wanted to ensure that the women in his family could sustain themselves through their properties instead of their political connections like Susan. This allowed them a steadier income and the power to make choices about which properties they wanted to rent or sell. Eventually, Augusta sold the property at auction in 1867 and continued living off her long list of real estate. Through the rent collected from Decatur House, Susan Decatur, Providence Gatsby, and Augusta McBlair were able to sustain themselves financially, make independent economic decisions, and exert their influence in Washington's high society. After the auction, the politically recognized Beale family acquired the property to function as their family home in D.C. Following the death of his parents, Truxton Beale married Mary Ogue and continued inhabiting Decatur House. The socialite couple hosted lively parties with their diplomatic, business, and political friends. After Truxton passed away in 1936, Mary Ogue kept living and hosting in Decatur House by herself. She had her own web of connections that extended as far as archdukes, viscounts, and princes that attended her annual Christmas parties. Because of her passions, she contributed to a lot of historical causes and used her political and diplomatic connections to leverage fundraising for these efforts. The women that owned Decatur House definitely held an advantage over other women in their time period. Owning property assured them a roof over their heads or a steady income after their husband's death. But women of color and lower classes weren't as lucky. They couldn't ensure that their homes wouldn't be taken away and encountered higher obstacles establishing their own families and businesses. But even though the obstacles were higher, we know that some of these less privileged women were still able to gain some economic security by navigating under the system. Although the women of Decatur House weren't afforded the same rights we experience today, they were still able to leverage their properties and political connections for their benefit. Each of these women took their unique circumstances and found a way of sustaining themselves economically, whether it be by collecting rent or using their relationships with important figures. And through their lavish parties, the people that they rented it to, and details that they remodeled or restored, they contributed just as much to Decatur House's history as their male counterparts.